Welcome to the second episode of the Travis on Sports podcast, where we talk about the latest sports news. I'm your host, Travis Tyler. As always, you can find the show on Spreaker and the Travis on Sports YouTube channel, and we are now available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. I'm working on getting the social media accounts ready and hope to have them up and running for the next episode. Apologize for being so late with this episode. There were some technical difficulties with editing the first episode, and that caused a bit of delay in publishing, but we're here now. So we're going to try to fit the last couple of weeks into this one. It's Thursday, August 26, 2021. On today's show, we're going to be talking about an injury that occurred to an LSU quarterback, NBA free agency from the beginning of the month, the shakeups in the college football world, and the new top 25 polls that were released before the season. We'll also update the MLB playoff race, talk about USA basketball's performance at the Olympics, the NHL's new sponsorship quirk, if you will, and the botching of a name change from one of the premier pro sports teams. Alright, so let's dive in here. Projected LSU starting quarterback Miles Brennan suffered a broken arm during a fishing trip just before reporting to fall camp. His dad says that he tripped on a dock when his sandal got caught while carrying his fishing gear, and the weight of the gear brought him down. Head coach Ed Orgeron has said that Brennan may be able to return by the mid-season and should be expected back with the team at some point this year. He was returning from a season-ending injury after completing 68% of his passes and throwing for over 1,000 yards with 11 touchdowns in just 3 games last year. The remaining quarterbacks on the roster are freshman Garrett Nussmeier, freshman Tavion Falk, sophomore Max Johnson, and Matt O'Dowd. Max Johnson and Garrett Nussmeier are the only 2 of those that are on scholarship. I haven't seen a starter named. I would expect Johnson to get that, but Nussmeier was a highly recruited player, 13th best quarterback prospect in the country, 9th best player in Texas. He's got good pedigree. His dad is Dallas Cowboys quarterback coach Doug Nussmeier, and he spent time as an offensive coordinator and quarterback coach with many teams and many schools over the course of his career. Max Johnson is also the son of a NFL veteran, as his dad is former Super Bowl winning quarterback Brad Johnson from the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, as well as the Cowboys and many other teams. Johnson started 2 games so far in his career and threw for over 1,000 yards and 8 touchdowns. LSU has a very good offensive line with, I believe, 3 pro prospects on there right now. For the 2022 draft, that is. But very little experience at the skill positions on offense. And, you can add quarterback to that part right now because, it's probably either going to be Nussmeier or Johnson. And yes, Johnson has the experience, but it's small sample size, so you really don't know what you're going to be getting from either one of them. Now to the NBA. Start of free agency was at the beginning of the month. But first we're going to look at the DeMar DeRozan trade between San Antonio and Chicago. The Spurs sent DeMar DeRozan in a sign-and-trade deal to the Chicago Bulls for Thaddeus Young, Al Farouk Aminu, a protected first-round draft pick, and 2 second-round draft picks. Now for the Bulls, I still think they're a couple years away from having any shot at competing. They seem to think that they're a little further along. I mean, I don't have the NBA package or anything, so I haven't been able to watch a lot of their games. But to me, looking at the roster, they're still a little bit away. They don't have a true superstar. They got a couple good players, but they don't have that true superstar, that number one that everybody's got to have, that can go down and make any shot for you when the game's on the line and you need to get a win. DeRozan's still not quite that guy. Yeah, he can score, and he's been an accomplished player, all-star throughout his career, but he's never been a lethal shooter. I mean, he can drive and sure get a bucket that way, but in today's game, you really need to spread the floor more and be lethal from the outside. And his best year was a respectable 33.8% from three-point range. But for his career, he shoots just 28%, and that's just not going to cut it. Now, don't get me wrong, he is a star player still, but I don't think he's a franchise player. I think he is a more accomplished version of what Zach LaVine is, who is already with the Chicago Bulls, in that they're both guards who are extremely athletic and can jump out of the gym and put you on a poster, and they're quick enough, and they, as far as I've seen, they can defend pretty well. But LaVine shoots much better than DeRozan does, so from that standpoint, I'm not sure it really makes sense. Plus, it's a ton to give up for a guy in his early to mid 30s. I mean, he can still play a decent amount. It's not like he's washed up or anything, but it was a big price to give up, especially with those picks, for a guy that he can guide some of the younger players, I guess. But you're more than one player away from being able to compete, and you're going to need to find a legitimate superstar to lead that team, and DeRozan, as good as he is not the number one player in the league. I also think their current lineup kind of lacks shooting. I mean, they have Nikola Vucevic, they signed Lonzo Ball and Alex Caruso to help that, and obviously LaVine. So there's four guys. I guess they could conceivably play together in a smaller lineup. Obviously, Vucevic is 7 feet, so that's not smaller. But in terms of smaller at the three position and out on the wings, I guess that that could work out at some point. Guys coming off the bench. For San Antonio, they've had a lot of good young guards on their team. And what they did with this trade was add veteran bigs to their roster of young guards. Now, DeMar DeRozan is definitely better than Thaddeus Young and Al-Farouq Aminu, but in terms of the overall roster, they really needed to get some guys in there so they weren't totally leaning on Jakob Poeltl to completely carry the load as a big. And they also collected future assets, especially that first-round pick. I know it's protected. I don't know what the actual protections are at this point, but that pick could potentially be very high because I'm not totally impressed with Chicago's roster right now. I mean, did they get better? Maybe, but it's just that pick could still end up somewhere in the lottery as soon as San Antonio gets it. Now to the free agency portion. I'm going to start with local Dallas Mavericks. It's not a homer thing. I'm not a Mavericks fan. Just the first thing that came to mind when I was looking at the thing was, the Mavericks were in the middle of the West at the 5 seed, and took the Clippers to the brink with Game 7. But realistically, they didn't do much to improve on what they had. They basically just went and re-signed everybody from the team, and then I guess Reggie Bullock is a solid shooter from the outside that they could add, but I feel like Hardaway was already filling that role, and they re-signed him, so how they craft out playing time for both of them should be interesting. They signed Luka to that long-term contract extension, and their roster is not bad, but in the West, especially with the teams getting better, they're probably fighting for a bottom 3 seed, to be honest, because, and by bottom 3, I mean 6, 7, 8, not the bubble. But to that point, they did just barely miss having to play in that bubble last year. And, bubble teams, San Antonio, I don't know if they necessarily got better, but they're at least added pieces that could potentially make them better. We'll have to see that on the court first. They added more shooting with Doug McDermott, Zach Collins. We talked about the bigs they added in the trade with Chicago. They brought Bryn Forbes back. He's a pretty good shooter. And they got the young guys like Pirtle and Derek White, Lonnie Walker, Keldon Johnson, Devin Vassell, DeJounte Murray. So there are pieces they're building, but I don't know if that comes to fruition this season. New Orleans, obviously, Zion's there. He's going to get better. They added Devontae Graham, who averages 14.8 points per game, 5.4 assists per game, and career path so far in the trajectory kind of reminds me of Terry Rozier, who he played with in Charlotte. I mean, Rozier, not a high draft pick, carved out a role and just took over the point guard duties with the Celtics and worked his way into a great contract for himself with Charlotte and became really the starting point guard. And I don't know if he's really a star at this point, but he's definitely a really, really good starting point guard. The Pelicans also re-signed Josh Hart, and they have Ingram, Jackson Hayes, Juan Hernan Gomez. Their biggest issue, I think, last year, I mean, there were definitely other issues, but I think their biggest issue was probably the point guard spot. And what did they do there? They added Devontae Graham, as I said, and they drafted a very talented point guard out of Alabama, I believe it was, and Kyra Lewis, who's possibly the fastest point guard in the draft from everything that I had seen. And, they have a young core that can grow together, and they could be an upcoming team. Memphis didn't really add anybody, but, I mean, you got Jaren Jackson Jr., Xavier Tillman, Dylan Brooks, John Morant, Tyus Jones, Brandon Clark, Kyle Anderson. They have really good young players. They didn't really need to add anybody. They just need those guys to, they could have added some veteran experience, I guess, but they needed those guys to kind of mold together and work together and grow as a group. And I think Memphis could be a dangerous team in a couple of years. I think they've shown that a little bit. And then Golden State, they didn't have Clay last year. They missed Steph a little bit. They're not the same team they once were, but they're getting Clay back. They'll have Steph, Draymond. They brought in Iguodala in free agency. He was a good part of their previous championship runs. And they added Moody and Kuminga. We'll see how those guys fit in. They also added Otto Porter Jr., who's a former top 5 pick, I believe. So he could fill in with Andrew Wiggins in that starting 3 role, push him for playing time. And then the biggest question for the Warriors is the center spot with James Wiseman, Jordan Bell, and Kevon Looney. They want more out of Wiseman,